Today, I'm answering all of your questions based on adult ADHD and the experience that we all struggle with, whether it's figuring out what to do with our lives or not knowing how to translate neurotypical advice for neurodivergence and everything else. And we're doing this Q&A in celebration of something pretty cool that recently happened. I finally crested the 100,000 subscriber mark, and I just got my little plaque in. I'm really proud, but there's no way I could have done this without all of you. So I really appreciate all of you who sent in questions. I'm going to try and get through as many as I can today, but I don't want this to get too long because we both know we don't like boring, right? So let's get into it. We're going to start off with the first question. I'm 41 with symptoms of perimenopause. I've been reading a lot about estrogen and dopamine and how hormone levels can make ADHD feel worse. Absolutely can. So I'd love to know, how have your symptoms changed as you've gone into your 40s, and what have you done differently to cope with the ups and downs of wonky hormone cycles and how they mess with your executive functions? To speak to my own experience, moving into perimenopause is really when my ADHD symptoms started to become unmanageable as an adult. I've talked about this before, but my symptoms were pretty prevalent before the age of 12, all the way up to, I would say, about 21. And then I got into fitness, and fitness became this way of compensating for a lot of my executive function impairments. There's a lot of research around fitness being like the next course of action next to medication for managing ADHD. And I do have some videos to that effect. I will link them up here if I can find it. But basically, my years of fitness stopped working when I entered perimenopause because my hormones started to fluctuate like this. And that's when I sought out a diagnosis because things became so unmanageable. So my own experience was extreme forgetfulness, moody and being irritated and not being able to focus on anything, like at the next level, because I've always somewhat struggled with those things, but it got to the point where I couldn't manage it myself anymore. And I heard somebody else explaining their experience with ADHD. And I thought, holy crap, maybe that's what's going on with me. And that's what made me seek out a diagnosis. So I don't know if I would have gotten a diagnosis had I not gone into perimenopause, where my estrogen levels just dumped. After the age of 35, women's estrogen levels start to really take a nosedive. And estrogen, which I didn't know, plays an enormous role in cognitive function and memory and learning and just emotional regulation. So when you're already struggling with those things because of ADHD, and then you go into perimenopause, it's just like the perfect storm. And it's a really good time to talk to your doctor about what you can do to manage it. What did I do to manage it? I got my diagnosis. I did go on medication, and I also went on hormone replacement therapy. And of course, I'm not going to recommend any of that to anyone. I'm just going to recommend that you talk to your doctor about what you're going through and see what your options are. And even if you don't have ADHD and you're going through perimenopause or menopause, I feel for you because it's a hard time. But there are ways to get through it. So I hope that you are able to talk to your family doctor about it, and hopefully they know enough about menopause symptoms that they don't poo-poo them, because there's a lot of doctors out there that don't know a lot about menopause or ADHD and will downplay your symptoms because they just don't know any better. So if you are getting the brush off from your family doctor, that's a good indication that you need a new family doctor. Okay, the next question comes from Laura, and she writes, I like books about time management like Atomic Habits and productivity like Deep Work. But sometimes when I binge James Clear's or Cal Newport's content, I realize how neurotypically geared it is. How do you adapt the principles from classic time management and or productivity gurus to work for neurodivergent brains? Okay, I love this question because I too love productivity related content and I do nerd out on this stuff. The first thing I'll say is that there's really no difference between neurotypical and neurodiverse productivity advice, if you will. There's just things that work for you and things that don't, because everyone's ADHD symptoms look different, right? The things that I struggle with from a ADHD standpoint might look very different from the things that you struggle with. And very often the neurotypical advice, if we want to call it that, starts with the assumption that our brain is in a place for us to sit down and focus on something. It assumes that whatever is in front of us, the task in front of us, is something that our brain will be able to wrap itself around on demand. And it also assumes that our energy and emotional regulation is all teed up in order to take in and execute on that productivity system, if you will. So, for example, James Clear talks a lot about habit stacking. So that will assume that you've already got a habit in place that you're able to do on a regular and a consistent basis in order for you to stack the next habit on top. So those are not inherently bad strategies for neurodivergence. The difference is that those of us with attention deficit issues, we have to do a lot of pre-work in order to get ourselves into a situation where we can actually take advantage of these productivity strategies. So we have to be well slept and maybe medicated, and we have to have had some food, and we have to be emotionally regulated. And all of these things have to be true in order for us to sit down and focus and actually take advantage of these productivity tools. So it starts with managing our state. And I have another video that I've done on this that I will link up here. I never know what side it's going to come up on, around what we can do in order to ensure that our energy and focus is primed to be at its best every day. And all of that comes back to self-care habits, which are going to look different for everyone. But the idea here is that we have to take extra steps to take care of ourselves to ensure we are in a position where we can be productive. So that, to me, is the biggest difference between neurotypical and neurodivergent productivity advice. There are some other differences, like, for example, we might have lower dopamine, which means we need to start with easier or more fun tasks first in order to generate enough dopamine to get into more complex tasks. So there are some variants, but the takeaway here is that whether you have ADHD or not, productivity advice always comes down to an example of n equals 1, meaning that every ADHDer you meet is going to be a little bit different and is going to approach productivity a little bit differently. And we all have to just experiment and figure out what works for us. And the best way to do that is to start by understanding what your cluster of executive dysfunctions really are. ADHD is a blanket term. So you may struggle with working memory and organization prioritization, where somebody else might struggle with time management and emotional regulation and auditory processing disorder. There's all of these different things under the heading of ADHD that impacts each ADHDer individually. So I'm going to link to a very simple worksheet below that will help you think through how your ADHD shows up for you specifically so that you can start to target the ADHD advice that works best for you and start to think about the ways where your ADHD actually gets in your way so that you can do all of that pre-work to get yourself in a position where you can be as productive as humanly possible. The one other thing that I will say as a proof point to what I've just told you is that James Clear has come out and said that he does have ADHD as well. So it's interesting that you think that his work is not designed for a neurodivergent when he is neurodivergent himself. So I hope that I've expanded everyone's thinking around how we find tools for managing our own specific ADHD. It's not an on or off switch. Everything is nuanced. So whatever you come across that either makes sense or doesn't make sense, always ask yourself, is there something I can take away from this? Or is there something that would work for me or that I want to experiment with? And then just leave the rest. All right. Next question. I just got diagnosed with ADHD about a month ago. Negative thoughts and emotional dysregulation are my concerns. The doctors don't really give you any help apart from getting in line for medication. Okay, that's very true. Once you get a formal diagnosis, the person who diagnoses you, whether it's a doctor or a psychologist, isn't necessarily going to do much in terms of treatment or showing you how to manage it. That is entirely on you, unfortunately. So they may be your point person for medication, but beyond that, the onus is on you to learn about this disorder and, more importantly, learn about how the symptoms line up with your experience. Like I mentioned before, the more you can understand your own cluster of symptoms, the more you can treat them specifically and get right to the crux of what's happening. You may already know that I have a program called Distraction Action that deals with a lot of ADHD symptoms as it relates to overwhelm, getting clear on what it is you want to do, setting goals, time management, creating boundaries, and actually following through. But there's other things under the umbrella of ADHD that you might need to build skills around, not interrupting people or spending without impulsivity or managing your emotions better. So it's a big umbrella topic, and it's really important that you become your own advocate and also your own researcher to figure out the best plan of action for you. And another great place to start with that is therapy or coaching specifically geared towards ADHD, if that's available to you. But if it's not, then listening to videos like this and podcasts and reading books is going to be the next best thing. And you actually can learn a lot based on all the information that's out there already. I just wouldn't recommend learning about it from TikTok. The next person comes from Samira. How do I help myself with intense change of mood and desire in every moment? Again, this comes down to emotional regulation. When we are emotionally dysregulated, our mood can be up here 1 minute and down here the next. And the way that we articulate our emotions can often be very impulsive. So we may say things that later we regret, or yell at people, or behave in a way that we wouldn't do otherwise if we took a moment to really think about how we felt. And that's a really big question, but I'm going to come back to a point I made earlier around, first of all, managing your state at a very high level. So figuring out, what do you need every day in order to be less like this, right? You probably need to look at your sleep patterns, what you're eating. Are you working out? Because very often emotional regulation is a lot of pent up hyperactivity. I'm not saying entirely, but this can play a role in it, that if you don't move your body regularly, you don't have a way to move that energy. And it just stays in here until somebody drives you crazy, and then and you say or do something that you regret. Now, there's a lot more that goes into emotional regulation. Like, for example, getting to understand your nervous system and understanding how you can expand your window of tolerance. I did another video on that, which I will leave up here. But basically what this means is the larger your window of tolerance is, the more you can manage your emotions in that window of tolerance, because you're able to tolerate more. But if you have a small window of tolerance, that means you're either going to freak out or shut down more often. Definitely go watch that video to learn more about that, but also become your own researcher and start learning how you can manage your emotions to become more even keel. When it comes to managing fluctuating desires, a lot of that is actually tied to fluctuating emotions. When you think about it, when you're in those low lows, your desires might be scrolling TikTok and eating M&Ms for hours on end. There's probably, if you're in that mode of self-soothing, there's probably some unmet needs that you have. And it might be that you're overtired, or you're hungry, or you've been overstimulated, or you're overwhelmed. So there's unmet needs that is giving you this low. And along with the low emotion, you have low desires. And then on the other hand, maybe you had too much sugar and all of a sudden you're at a high and your desires are different. So maybe you're impulsively spending, or you impulsively agree to do something that when you're more even keel, you would never agree to do. Again, it comes back to trying to figure out how to manage your state on the daily. What habits do you need to manage your state so it's more like this? And that will have an impact on highly fluctuating desires. All human beings in general do have fluctuating desires, but I know what you're saying here. You're saying your desires are up and down. So start with working on your emotional regulation and see how that impacts your desires. And hopefully you'll start to see a positive impact in both arenas. The next question comes from Stino. I have to wait about a year for my ADHD test here in the Netherlands. Any thoughts on alternatives to medication for it? Yes, there's a lot of things I can share with you on that. And I will link a video up here about a few other things that changed the game for me in terms of managing my own ADHD before I got a diagnosis. But a lot of the things I just mentioned are really relevant. Like getting super dialed in on your sleep is so important for ADHDers. Finding the right kind of movement that helps you with managing your brain. Usually that's like at least 20 minutes of cardio a day, and it gets blood flow up to the brain. But You might want to do different things. You might enjoy yoga because there's a lot of research that indicates that any sort of balanced postures or balanced workouts can help to improve cognitive function. And racket sports as well also have some connection to improve cognitive function. And then managing your diet. There is some research out there that indicates that, a good diet is obviously going to help with cognitive function, and just making sure that you are setting yourself up for success by getting very curious about your own self-care needs and how you show up as your best. And then again, also managing that window of tolerance to make sure that your nervous system is as prepared as it can to deal with your specific cluster of ADHD symptoms, whether it's overwhelm, overstimulation, or forgetfulness or time blindness, and then creating tools around whatever your worst symptoms are so that you can start to manage them better. And the more you can manage your symptoms at the end of the day, the smaller your ADHD becomes, to the point where it's almost non-existent, as long as you keep moving forward on the habits that serve you the best. The next question comes from Cozy Game Cafe. Where do most ADHDers go wrong in business, and how can we avoid it? That's a broad question, and as I've already mentioned, everybody's ADHD symptoms show up a little bit differently. But if I were to pinpoint one thing that I see a lot in my clients, ADHDers generally are quite impulsive people, which means that when we think about something we want to do, we are ready to dive right in, which on the one hand makes us very quick to get started on something. But on the other hand, we don't often think through all of the steps and potentially all of the consequences and the load that it's going to take on our emotional, financial, and time resources. So in an entrepreneurial perspective, that can often mean like getting into a business before fully thinking through what your offer is and who your customer is and what the solution is. There's a lot of things that need to happen before you become an entrepreneur, and ADHDers can often breeze by those things. And sometimes that works out for them, sometimes. But very often it ends up getting us into a space of overwhelm or in over our heads, or ultimately we might give up or the business will fail. And I can speak from experience on that one, like at least 5 times over, which is why I created a Line to Start. And this isn't a commercial for it, but it is a program specifically for folks who are thinking of starting a business. How do you think about all of these things, not only in relation to the business, but in relation to you as the entrepreneur? What is your energy level? What is your interest, your strengths? How do you want to run a business? Are you introverted or extroverted? And those sort of things that are really important to think about before you ever put a shingle out there that you're starting a business. So that's one thing I can think of. There's a lot of reasons, but there's also equally as many, if not more, reasons why ADHDers make great entrepreneurs, because we're good in a crisis and we're very creative. We think on our feet and we're divergent thinkers, so we can come up with a different solutions. Problem is, very often we want to act on all of them at the same time too. So the way we approach entrepreneurship is very different, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's better or worse. It's just very different than how a neurotypical might approach the same business. Next and last question. What are your qualifications, education, and experience? I can tell you something. That is the first time that anyone has ever asked me about my qualifications or experience in a coaching capacity, if you want to call it that. And I share that because so many coaches start out thinking, oh, I need to get ICF certified and I need to have all of these labels after my name so that people take me serious as a coach. And again, that was the first time I've ever been asked that. Thank you for the question. So qualifications, I have a certification in ADHD coaching specifically. So the program I went through is specific to ADHD and uses the latest in neuroscience and psychology to develop tools to help adults or children with ADHD deal with their symptoms better. I also have 2 psychology degrees, an undergrad and a master's degree, and 54 years of living with ADHD myself. And only the last 3 or 4 years have I actually been diagnosed. So that's my experience and qualifications. I don't think that makes me an expert by any means, but you asked, so I shared. I hope that was helpful. And thank you again, not only for submitting questions, but for being here and hanging out with me for almost 4 years now. I can't believe it. And on that note, I will see you in the next episode. Bye for now, guys.